The Marmoset by Mark R. Schorer and August W. Derleth. From Weird Tales, September 1926. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Dale Grothman. The Marmoset by Mark L. Schorer and August W. Derleth. The dark figure of a man slunk silently through the byways and alleys of Florence. He kept to the clutching shadows, avoiding the moonlight as much as possible. Once, when he unwittingly stepped into a bright patch of light, the rays of the moon beamed brightly on something visible below the belt of his doublet. But he hastily drew back into the shadows, and the gleam vanished. Once he halted and listened attentively, because he thought he had heard a sound. But it was only a cat. Again, a bat swept by him in the darkness, and he shuddered, and it flew out into the moonlight, and wheeled about in the calm summer air, casting a grotesque shadow upon the paving stones in the patch of light. He watched it, fascinated. A moth whirred out of its retreat into the moonlight, and before he quite grasped the rapidity of the thing, the man saw the bat sweep downward, and the moth was no longer there. He smiled in secret admiration of the feat. Like a bat, he would accomplish his objective under the sheltering robe of night. He glanced eagerly down the street. A single, feeble, illuminated window greeted his gaze. But it was a window in a house to which he was directed. He fumed impatiently and glanced up at the moon, which was already starting its descent into the westward. For quite some time he stood there in the shadows. Monsieur Mary was late in retiring. But no matter, the watching man could attain his objective, if wait he must until morning. The window was dark now, but he must bide his time and give the magician a space in which to fall into slumber. There was no doubt that it was Monsieur Mary who had bewitched his daughter, and now she was gone. His hand wandered to the hilt of his dagger, and he grasped the weapon to make certain that it was still firmly in its place. What was it he saw in the door of the magician's squat residence? He gazed intently at it. It was naught else but the figure of the wizard leaving the house and starting down the street. Monsieur Como watched the magician silently, and wondered where he could be going. Suddenly he was seized with the idea of entering the house and secreting himself therein in Monsieur Mary's absence. He slunk forward again, and soon he was pushing at the door of the house. It yielded to his touch, and Monsieur Como entered. There was a patch of moonlight on the floor, and Monsieur Como searched for a hiding place. He noticed glowing embers in the grate, and wondered for what Monsieur Mary had needed a fire on such a warm night. Something shot across the patch of moonlight, and a second later Monsieur Como felt it brushing against his legs. A cat, perhaps. He reached downward and struck the furry mass. At his action, the injured creature started to glimmer demonically. It was gone now, and sat in the moonlight shaking its tiny furry fist at Monsieur Como. It was a marmoset, and its big eyes caught and reflected the moonlight as it blinked them furiously at Monsieur Como. Monsieur Como went over to it, and attempted to pacify it, but his efforts only served to increase the fury of the little beast. It glimmered incessantly, and Monsieur Como apprehensively wondered how quickly Monsieur Mary would return. For a minute he considered dispatching the animal, but then he thought better of it and drew back into the shadows, leaving the marmoset to itself. For a short space the creature remained silent, and Monsieur Como was about to breathe a sigh of relief, when it again started to clatter more vehemently than before, and at the same time Monsieur Como heard a step resound in the court without. He half unloosed his dagger and felt his other weapon in the bosom of his doublet. The marmoset gibbered shrilly and jumped up and down on the stone floor in its anger. The door opened, and Monsieur Mari entered. He halted at the threshold and stared at his pet. "Ah," he said, "something has disturbed my little pet. Is it not so, Chiro?" He walked over to the candles in the brackets. "Perhaps," he continued, "perhaps we have a visitor." He removed a candle and walked over to the fireplace. "We shall see, Chiro, in a space." He lit the candle at the embers, and, without glancing around him, walked to the sconce and ignited the remaining flambeau. He turned, and his eyes fell upon Monsieur Como standing quietly near the entrance, his hand guiltily clutching the hilt of the dagger. The magician glanced at the marmoset. "You see, Chiro, I was correct. We have a visitor." The animal blinked solemnly back at him, and at intervals it gibbered excitedly. Monsieur Mari continued. "Sit down, Monsieur Como, sit down. I am sure that your intentions are the best, even though your hand rests upon your dagger. Possibly a habit, Monsieur Como, most probably a habit." He turned to the animal on the floor again. "It is most fortunate that he comes, eh, Chiro?" The creature moved forward and caught at Monsieur Mari's robe, and in a few seconds it was perched upon his shoulder. In a monotone, Monsieur Mari spoke a few words to his pet. The monkey jumped to the floor and raced over to Monsieur Como, and almost before Monsieur Como was aware of it, the marmoset was running off with his dagger. But he contented himself with the thought that he still had another dagger, in the form of a stiletto, in the bosom of his doublet. The wizard addressed Monsieur Como. "Yes, Monsieur Como, it is so fortunate that you have come. I am so in need of someone to aid me. It is kind of you." He smiled sardonically. Monsieur Como strove to answer, but he was totally unnerved by the calm of his would-be victim. "Yes, Monsieur Como. Today I have compounded 2 liquids, both poison. One should kill within a quarter hour, the other not for 2 months. I am very much in need of someone to test these for me, monsieur." He smiled, but the glint in his eyes belied the smile. He continued. "First, I think we shall try the more deadly of the 2. He moved over to a shelf near the fireplace, from which he removed 2 phials. Meanwhile, Monsieur Como sat. He uttered not a sound, but stared at the magician, fascinated. All his plans of vengeance had dissolved into thin air, and his one thought was escape from this fiend who threatened his existence. He was seated near the open door, but Monsieur Mari's marmoset, which was between him and the door, was fingering the dagger it had stolen, and once in a space it glared evilly at Monsieur Como. Undoubtedly the animal could not kill, but even a scratch from the weapon would suffice to dispatch one, for Monsieur Como had taken the precaution to dip the end of the blade into a deadly compound. The window, as a means of escape, was far too distant. Dully he watched the wizard at his task of removing the phials. Monsieur Mari walked over and stood before him. He held aloft a phial and spoke. "This, Monsieur Como, is the more deadly." The liquid was as colorless as the glass that contained it. "A drop, monsieur, or 2 drops, will plunge you into the most excruciating pains you can experience. While you will not be conscious of any exterior pain, you will nevertheless suffer most horribly." He uncorked the phial as he spoke. "First, Monsieur Como, there will be a terrible burning feeling as the liquid travels down the gullet. But that, monsieur, is naught compared to the gnawing pain in the vitals. 1,000 times you will wish yourself dead. 1,000 times you will regret that you had ever been born. Then, monsieur, it will attack your brain in a most subtle manner. All you will see will appear a bright, glaring red, and suddenly you will go blind." He looked at Monsieur Como suggestively. Monsieur Como's forehead was covered with a cold sweat of terror. "But," continued the wizard, "if I should see that the poison is beginning to take effect, I shall possibly give you a few drops of a mixture which I have concocted to counteract its effect. Possibly, monsieur." The ominous accent on the word "possibly" did not escape Monsieur Como's notice. "And, monsieur, if you but taste the other liquid," here he removed the stopper of the remaining phial, "you will wish to be back in the tortures of the first poison. The first poison is merciful in comparison to the latter. For 2 months, monsieur, you will live upon a rack. Everything you touch will seem like hot coals. Everything you eat will taste like putrefied flesh. But enough of my inadequate description. You shall see for yourself." Monsieur Como seemed to have shrunk in his clothes, for he sat immobile, staring at the marmoset that had defeated his purpose. The magician was advancing toward him, the phials containing the fatal poisons grasped firmly in his hands. But at that moment the wizard's pet leapt away from the door. With a hoarse cry, Monsieur Como flung himself into the court without. Calmly the magician poured the water and the phials out upon the flagstones at the threshold. He stood in the doorway and chuckled exultantly to himself, the marmoset clinging to his doublet, as he watched Monsieur Como run swiftly down the street. It was simple, he reflected, so simple to play upon this man's imagination. He had come to murder him, had he? The wizard laughed. Poison? He had none in his residence, for that very day the Duc de Medici had purchased his entire stock. He laughed again and stared after Monsieur Como, almost out of sight down the long street. But the fury of Monsieur Como was too much for him to contain, so he halted, half turned, and saw the magician standing in the doorway. In the space of a second Monsieur Como had formulated a plan. He left the center of the street and melted into the shadows on the side. He grasped the stiletto in his bosom. The blade of this tool had been poisoned. So Monsieur Mari would poison him, eh? Well, he would show him. He would give him a generous taste of his own medicine. Hidden in the shadows, he crept toward the magician's house. He was close enough now. He could easily reach the wizard with his weapon from where he stood. He drew the stiletto from his doublet and, raising his arm, threw it with all his strength, then turned and fled fleetly down the street. There was a brilliant flash in the moonlight, a shrill, piercing scream, and the magician crumbled to the flagstones before his house. For days afterward, people wondered at the significance of the cold body of the magician with the stiff marmoset impaled to his breast by the long-bladed stiletto. The end of The Marmoset by Mark R. Schorer and August W. Derleth.
Spooky Ventures is the home for spooky content and spooky merchandise on the web. Check it out today at spookyventures.com. And remember, always keep it spooky.